B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, August 31st, 2020. Our dear tweeter, the stable genius, set an almost new record. Saturday night and Sunday, tweeting over 100 times, and in many cases seeking to fan the flames in both Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Portland, Oregon. Yes, Trump has been busy, and we see this clearly as a campaign tactic to divide Americans, to stand up for what is right and white, in his view, and to demand law and order, without ever for a moment addressing the underlying conditions that have triggered the more than 90 days of street protests in Portland and the reaction to the police shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So he posted or reposted 89 messages between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. on Sunday. Then he took time off to play golf and came back and started tweeting again. And he'd been up late on Saturday night with 18 tweets. And, of course, this becomes so numerous that only his Twitter followers actually see all of these messages. And I have to say I'm somewhat relieved that Twitter, which has been sending me unsolicited tweets from the twit, you know what I meant, they didn't do that at all over the weekend. So it made things a little more pleasant for me. But here's one of those tweets. According to the mainstream media, the riots and extreme violence are completely unorganized. However, it appears this coup attempt is led by a well-funded network of anarchists trying to take down the president. Now, that was the retweet of a quote from a program on one of his favorite channels, not Fox News. No, they've fallen out of favor to some extent with Trump, but the One American News Network, which is based in San Diego, and is all pro-Trump all the time, 24/7. So this is a serious problem. And it is evidenced by the actions that are attributed to the accused shooter in Kenosha, 17-year-old Trump supporter Kyle Rittenhouse, and the Saturday night shooting on the streets of Portland, Oregon, of one of the prayer people. I don't think that's the exact right name of the group. I'll get it to you in a second here. It's in my notes. But this is a serious problem. And the suspect in the shooting in Portland is a man who is described as a regular attendee of the anti-Trump, pro-police reform protests in Portland. So Trump is, of course, only going to amp up his messaging. He believes this is a route to victory, to scare the shit out of the average white American, claiming that even if you're in the suburbs, you're not safe. And if Joe Biden is president, you'll never be safe. That was the theme at the convention last week, and it's clearly what he thinks is going to help him solidify his base, and he thinks it will expand, I guess, but I don't see that. To his credit, Ted Wheeler, who's a fairly moderate mayor of Portland, came out swinging and talked back to Trump. Let's listen.
President Trump, for 4 years, we've had to live with you and your racist attacks on black people. We learned early about your sexist attitudes towards women. We've had to endure clips of you mocking a disabled man. We've had to listen to your anti-democratic attacks on journalists. We've read your tweets slamming private citizens to the point of receiving death threats. And now you're attacking Democratic mayors and the very institutions of democracy that have served this nation well since its founding. Do you seriously wonder, Mr. President, why this is the first time in decades that America has seen this level of violence? It's you who have created the hate and the division. The tweets that he has been putting out in the last 48 hours, attacking Democratic mayors, attacking those who are trying to bring resolution to the violence in their local communities. He has an opportunity to uplift us and bring us together and help us move through this difficult situation in our nation's history, and instead he chooses to play petty politics and divide us. That's my reaction. So I'm going to do the work that I need to do here in my local community with my local officials to take accountability for what's happening on our streets. And I'd appreciate that either the president support us or he stay the hell out of the way.
So those are strong words from a mere mayor. And, of course, Trump fired back on Twitter and trashed him, saying that he's a dummy and that if they can't handle it, that we should send in the National Guard. And this really is laying the groundwork for civil unrest. And I don't want to be too extreme in making predictions, but these are the initial skirmishes of a potential civil war. And depending on the reported outcome of the election, which will not come on election night because of the wider use of mail-in balloting, you could see Trump try to put out the whistle to the armed vigilantes, these Trump militia groups that are willing to bring their guns to the streets. And, as I've said, this is a very dangerous situation, and the president is pouring gasoline on a fire that's already burning pretty strongly. So in Portland, they have named a suspect, and his name is Michael Rhinoel. He's described as a self-styled anti-fascist and a professional snowboarder and a contractor who hated his time in the Army, and members of his family who describe him as estranged watched video and confirmed that because of a distinctive tattoo that is visible on his neck, that he appears to be the one in the video who fired the shots that killed a counter-protester, a conservative, on the streets of Portland Saturday night, and that was around 9 p.m. And when you dig into his file, he's wanted on a failure to appear warrant from earlier this year, June 8th, in eastern Oregon. He and his 17-year-old son were racing in two different cars at speeds up to 110 miles an hour, and his 11-year-old daughter was in the car when the police stopped his 2005 Cadillac STS. And according to that report, police found marijuana, unidentified prescription pills, and a loaded Glock pistol, for which Rhinoel did not have a concealed handgun license. So I want to be very clear that I do not condone violence by anyone against anyone else during these protests. And I want to, unequivocally state that because we are now under attack from the right wing for insufficient rejection of violence. This is another tactic that Trump uses to divide Americans and try to create an us versus them mentality, with liberals being them, the other. And so these are dangerous times, and I will not remain silent in the face of this kind of violence. So the right-wing group whose name I was looking for is Patriot Prayer, and they are headquartered or located just over the northern border of Oregon in Vancouver, Washington. And Governor Kate Brown of Oregon is saying the right-wing group Patriot Prayer and self-proclaimed militia members drove into downtown Portland Saturday night armed and looking for a fight. Every Oregonian has the right to freely express their views without fear of deadly violence. I will not allow Patriot Prayer an armed white supremacist to bring more bloodshed to our streets. And she once again called out the state troopers of the Oregon State Police to assist in crowd control and patrolling in Portland. And the man who captured the shooting incident on video is 44-year-old Justin Dunlap. He works as a lighting designer, but he's out of work. And so since he has so much spare time, he's been taking his camera phone, I believe on a selfie stick, and he has been live streaming the events onto his Facebook page. So the individual who was shot and killed on the streets of Portland Saturday night is referred to as Aaron J. Danielson, and he used a pseudonym, I think J. Bishop or something like that. So here's an account of the incident from Justin Dunlap. He said he was walking south on the east side of 3rd Street, about to cross the Alder intersection, as he talked and filmed with his phone, and then he heard some men yelling on the west side of that street. A man facing north was interacting with 2 men facing south. I saw the victim pull something up from his hip with his right hand, and a big cloud of mace goes in the air. Then half a second later, there were 2 pops. The staccato sounds were unmistakably gunshots, he said. Dunlap saw a man turn around, take 3 or 4 steps, and then collapse in the street. And on the video, he pretty well pronounced him dead. I very easily could have been in a life-ending injury, he said, but it was very clear that the man had been fatally shot. Last night in Portland, the scene was much mellower. They described just about 100 protesters. The Oregonian reports a small, fairly subdued crowd drew a forceful police response on Sunday night. They once again targeted a police headquarters in the Penumbra Kelly building downtown. Police quickly declared an unlawful gathering. They did not call it a riot, but they also sent officers out to clear the streets, and 29 people, including 2 youths, were arrested on suspicion of charges including disorderly conduct, interfering with a peace officer. 2 people who were arrested had loaded guns. So this is a serious problem, and I do have some listeners in Portland, and the ones I know are responsible people who would not be packing heat at a street protest. But in case you're not one of those people, can I beg you? Don't give Trump any further ammunition, and don't allow these confrontations to lead to more loss of life. You can back away. Let the prayer boys, or whatever the hell they're called, let them have their moment. They have a right to protest. I don't like their message, and I don't support it whatsoever. But we really need to dial back the level of confrontation. The other way that Trump is stoking this is he is insisting on flying into Kenosha, Wisconsin on Tuesday, tomorrow. While the wounds are still fresh and the peace is, I believe, quite tenuous, I'm not aware of any significant conflict that surfaced over the weekend under the gaze of the Wisconsin National Guard. Well, the White House press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, said that Trump is going to go, even though the state's governor and the mayor, who was a little less explicit, both said that this is not a good time for a presidential visit. And also, McEnany said that Trump is not ready to take a position on the actions attributed to Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old armed vigilante. And among his tweets and retweets, Trump retweeted comments that were praising Kyle Rittenhouse. So we're learning through a leak from a Facebook employee to BuzzFeed that when the webpage of the Kenosha Guard, a self-styled militia that is organized by a former city council member in Kenosha, when they posted on their page a week ago Sunday, inviting people to come and patrol the streets of Kenosha and to bring their guns, we still don't know if Kyle Rittenhouse responded to one of those posts. But it's a big problem for Facebook. And now we know that different users flagged Facebook at least 455 times after the Kenosha Guard posting was put up. It was reviewed by 4 moderators who said, hey, no problem. They said it was non-violating. And it took them until Wednesday, well after the shooting, late Tuesday night, for Facebook to pull those down. And put the 455 complaints in this context, the number 2 most complained about post that same day was only reported by 18 Facebook users. And I don't know if you've tried to report an obnoxious post or one that you think violates the Facebook rules. When you do, you get an automated response. Thank you. And they tell you, we're going to look into this and we might get back to you, but there is no way to contact a human being related to the content of Facebook pages. You can't make a phone call. You can't directly email. You go through their internal system, and you have no control over what happens next. And Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook founder, said that the company didn't catch the page and didn't pull it down under their section called Dangerous Individuals and Organizations because the complaints had been sent to content moderation contractors who were not versed in how certain militias operate. So Facebook's whole system, well, let me back up. Fundamentally, Facebook continues to claim that it's not a publisher. It's just a conduit for user content. And here we see that they have an obligation, and their own policies require them to respond when calls to violence, when there are other policies related to election integrity. And they should have many more categories. But they're pretending that we're not a publisher, so we don't make those kind of editorial judgments. And not being a publisher fits into their whole business model, which in my view is separated from reality, similar to the way Lyft and Uber claim that, their workers are not independent contractors, even though that is specifically defined by law in California today. These tech companies consider themselves disruptors. And when that disruption leads to policies that in turn lead to violence on the streets, we got a problem, Houston. Yes, we do. So Joe Biden went to Pittsburgh today, and he gave a pretty strong speech. He denounced the Trump campaign strategy of blaming Democrats for the violence that's taken place at some protests in American cities. Quote, since they have no agenda or vision for a second term, Trump and Pence are running on this. And I find it fascinating. You won't be safe in Joe Biden's America? And what's their proof? The violence we're seeing is in Donald Trump's America. Now, it's very interesting because Biden is accurate in saying that. The entire country is under Trump's purview right now. But Mark Meadows, his chief of staff, he claims that the violence is just in the areas that aren't Trump's America. So Trump is defining himself as only the president of his own supporters. And the rest of us, be damned. So not long after Biden concluded his speech, where you heard me just quote, and this gets complicated, but Biden was quoting the comments that came from Mike Pence and from Donald Trump in their acceptance speeches for the Republican National Convention last week. So not long after Biden concluded his speech today, the Trump War Room tweeted a 3-second clip of Biden saying, "You won't be safe in Biden's America." Now, that's really juvenile. It's grade school. And it's just this kind of, a teenage tactic. Neener, neener, neener. And this forced Twitter to label that tweet manipulated media. And I'm not sure if that means they'll actually take it down. But it will be at least flagged. And that is so lame. Anyway, then the Biden campaign responded to the clip of Joe saying you won't be safe in Joe Biden's America with this. The Trump campaign manipulated a video from Joe Biden's speech today because they could not challenge the content of the speech. This is their game. They cannot and will not compete on the facts. And then the Trump campaign fired back. To all the triggered journalists who can't take a joke about their candidate, it's not our fault. Joe Biden was dumb enough to say this on camera. And so there are no standards. And this goes beyond decency or indecency. This is just what is that called? The UFC? These people who fight without rules. That's the way I see this. And it will only sink us lower into this kind of partisan conflict and combat. So here is the statement from McEnany. The White House declined to comment and to condemn the actions of Kyle Rittenhouse, who's charged with homicide after opening fire on the protesters in Kenosha last Tuesday night. Quote, the president is not going to, again, weigh in on that. You can ask him this evening. He may weigh in further, but at the moment, he's not weighing into that. Well, he weighs into everything. He has no sense of propriety, responsibility. And so for him to suddenly be reticent to comment just shows the consciousness of his malintent. I guess that's the best way to put it. So this is going to be a messy campaign. And we have almost 10 weeks. I guess 10 weeks tomorrow is Election Day. And over the weekend, Steve Scalise, who drew some sympathy, when he was shot by a gunman at that softball game in Washington. Well, he went on the attack against Biden over the weekend using a selectively edited clip of Adi Barkan. And Barkan interviewed Biden, and it's where Biden ended by saying, yes, absolutely. And that clip has been used and abused by the Republicans, misquoted in the convention speeches last week. And when you look at the full context, Barkan had argued, we can reduce the responsibilities assigned to the police and redirect some of the funding for police into social services, mental health counseling, and affordable housing. And Barkan interjected, but do we agree that we can redirect some of the funding? And that's what Biden said, yes, absolutely to. And so the way they are seizing upon statements that Biden has made, statements that his allies have made, taking them out of context, editing them for spin. This is a new low in campaigning in this country, and it shows just how desperate the Trump team actually is. So in Kentucky today, the Attorney General announced that he received a ballistics report on the police shooting of Breonna Taylor. But he won't tell us what the report reports. He calls it a critical piece of the investigation. But, and the guy's name is Daniel Cameron, Cameron declined to say what the ballistics report found or what further information was needed before his office would make a decision about criminal charges in the case. And I give the New York Times credit for a pretty deep investigation of Breonna Taylor and the events of the night when she was shot and killed by a police raid. And some of this reporting does, how can I put it? It provides context. And it, I think, helps explain the complexity of this case. And fundamentally, Breonna Taylor had been dating two guys. And she gave one of them the heave about a month before the shooting took place. And his name is Jamarcus Glover, a 30-year-old drug dealer who had spent years in and out of prison, and at times she bailed him out, at times she loaned him her car. There are times that the New York Times reports that Breonna Taylor went and picked him up. There is an allegation that she was holding $14,000 of drug-related cash from Marcus. From Glover. So we're told that they broke up and she broke it off a month before this incident, and her new boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, was the one who was in the apartment. And when the police rammed down their door, Walker said later that he was concerned that it was Glover, because Glover had dropped by her apartment unannounced on at least one previous occasion. And that appears to be what led Walker to fire his own Glock, he said, for the only time he's ever fired it outside of a gun range. So there was a warrant. The police had raided a number of locations related to Glover's drug activities. In the other apartments, they found quite a lot of stuff. Drugs, drug paraphernalia, guns, and cash. So it is a more complicated story. And I'm not for a moment justifying the police action, because it appears the shots that killed Breonna Taylor came from an officer who was outside the apartment. And once the first shot was fired by Walker, he just started going blam, blam, blam. Didn't appear to be concerned about neighbors in the apartment upstairs or the building behind there. But we do have to be fair about the full context of the incident. So tomorrow is primary day in Massachusetts, and the focus of attention is on the Senate primary, where Joseph Kennedy III is trailing in the polls as he tries to oust the sitting Democratic Senator Ed Markey. And I have my issues with Markey, particularly on foreign policy. But he's been really good on media reform, and I've interviewed him several times. He is a real leader on response to climate change, co-author with AOC of the Green New Deal. And young Joe Kennedy is trying to take things down the middle. He believes that his family name and his youth will put the dynasty of the Kennedy clan back into the U.S. Senate. And frankly, I was surprised when Speaker Pelosi, who rarely intervenes in a Senate primary and less rarely intervenes in primaries in her own House of Representatives, that she jumped in to support Kennedy at the expense of Ed Markey. New polling shows that Trump did not see an increase in his favorability rating after the incredible 4 nights of myth-making, fiction, and Messiah building around his cult. And as I've commented, he didn't lift a finger to try to help people who call themselves Republicans and who have aligned with Trump out of fear of being tweeted into oblivion. And I'm referring to candidates for the Senate and the House. He did not lift any finger to try to help them. And maybe that is by understanding. Maybe they're saying, look, you're not helpful to me. So go ahead and run your own campaign and let me run mine, and I hope my voters don't make too clear a linkage between me and you, Mr. Trump. Michael Moore has made a public warning over the last few days. He said, sorry to have to provide the reality check again, but he fears that Trump could win in November. And I share that fear. As we'll get to in a couple of minutes, I had a great conversation today that we'll be releasing later today with Thomas Frank, the author of What's the Matter with Kansas, Listen Liberal, The Wrecking Crew, and he has a brand new book about the history of the progressive movement in this country. And you may recall that 4 years ago, right after both of the party conventions, I bet Tom Frank $5 that Trump was going to win. He took the bet, and he did reconsider just before the election. He published a column saying that he feared that Hillary was going to lose. So with Michael Moore launching this warning, and of course he went on to, in my view, dirty himself with these desperate, there was a video released right before the election where Michael Moore was desperately trying to prop up Hillary Clinton. But his latest comment, are you ready for a Trump victory? Are you mentally prepared to be outsmarted by Trump again? Do you find comfort in your certainty that there's no way Trump can win? Are you content with the trust you've placed in the Democratic National Committee to pull this off? He said, I'm warning you almost 10 weeks in advance. The enthusiasm level for the 60 million in Trump's base is off the charts. For Joe, not so much. He also wrote, the Biden campaign just announced he'll be visiting a number of states, but not Michigan. Sound familiar? Well, it's too familiar. He also, it was 2016 when he said, Trump's election is going to be the biggest fuck up ever, the biggest fuck you ever recorded in human history. So I invite you to listen to my fascinating interview. I enjoyed it. I hope you do too, with Tom Frank. His new book about the history of populism and anti-populism in this country is called The People, No. And as he explains in the interview, populists are seen as an impediment to democracy by the elites who aren't really interested in true democracy. And here's an excerpt from my conversation with Tom Frank, where he talks about his takeaways from the messages of the Democratic National Convention and what is missing.
When you watched the Democratic Convention, you came away with three messages that they really emphasized. One is that the Democratic Party is the party of diversity. Two is that Joe Biden is a really nice guy.
Yeah.
And three is that Donald Trump represents a singular menace to the democratic tradition. And then here's the critical thing: nothing else.
Yeah.
Or very, very little else. And you and I are old enough that we remember democratic conventions. The theme was always the same: the middle class.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a euphemism for the working class. What are we doing for middle class people? What are we doing for average Americans? And it was always this sort of long list of promises that they then, of course, only honored in the breach. But at least they always did that. That's traditionally who they always were. Mm-hmm. And that was conspicuously missing this time. In their great big advertisement for the Democratic Party, that's a group that's just gone. They have given up on them, and there's not much of an effort to win them back.
That's journalist, author, and historian Thomas Frank. The full interview will be available to Peter B. Collins listeners and subscribers today You can find it at TuneIn, iTunes, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And I always like to thank the subscribers who make it all possible and get first dibs on our in-depth interviews. People like Ed Berwick, William Silverman, Janet Price, and Peter J. Hoffmeister. They each chip in $5, maybe $10 a month to help support the podcast, and I invite you to join them. Just stop by at peterbcollins.com/sign up. And one of the other things I discussed with Tom Frank is the nascent movement for a third major party in the United States, and it's called the People's Party. And yesterday, at the behest of a number of listeners, I spent about an hour and a half watching online the various speakers who came on promoting the idea of a third party. And you can just do a search online, the movement for a People's Party, and it'll bring you up to speed with some of the ideas and some of the people who are supporting the creation of a third party. And one of the best speeches I heard came from Chris Hedges, who takes on the oligarchs in his characteristic blunt style.
There is only one choice in this election, and that is the consolidation of oligarchic power under Donald Trump or the consolidation of oligarchic power under Joe Biden. The oligarchs with Trump or Biden will win again, and we will lose. The oligarchs made it abundantly clear, should Bernie Sanders have miraculously become the Democratic Party nominee, they would join forces with the Republicans to crush him. The oligarchs preach the mantra of the least worst to us when they attempt to ram a Hillary Clinton or a Joe Biden down our throats, but ignore it for themselves. They prefer Biden over Trump, but they can live with either. Only one thing matters to the oligarchs. It is not democracy. It is not truth. It is not the consent of the governed. It is not income inequality. It is not the surveillance state. It is not endless war. It is not jobs. It is not the climate breakdown. It is the primacy of corporate power, which has extinguished our democracy and left most of the working class and the working poor in misery, as well as the continued increase and consolidation of their wealth. It is impossible to work within the system to shatter the hegemony of oligarchic power or institute meaningful reform. Change, real change, will only come by sustained acts of mass civil disobedience and mobilization, as with the Yellow Vest movement in France and the British-based Extinction Rebellion.
So I'm going to put up a link to the YouTube site where you can watch the video. It runs just under 10 minutes. And I'm sure you can also find the peoplesparty.org for more information about their efforts to launch a third party. Back in April, when they passed the CARES Act, I commented that it temporarily offered a kind of universal health insurance coverage, because the CARES Act said that if you didn't have health insurance and you were hospitalized with COVID-19, that the government would pay the bills. But it turns out that when you get to the fine print and when you get to the malintent of the people who wrote that, well, a lot of poor people who went to the hospital believing that their bills would be covered have received some really exorbitant invoices. Like Marilyn Cortez, a retired cafeteria worker in Houston, she spent much of July in the hospital, and she just got home recently to get a bill for $36,000. And then we also get the case of a man named Luis Fernandez. He hasn't had health insurance in years, 16 days in the hospital, $85,000. And these are people who clearly do not have that kind of money, even if they wanted to pay it. And according to this front pager in Sunday's New York Times, large numbers of patients have been disqualified because COVID-19 has to be the primary diagnosis for a case to be covered. And since patients often have other serious medical conditions, many have other primary diagnoses. At the Jackson Health Center in Miami, only 60% of uninsured COVID-19 patients had decisively met the requirements. And in other cases, it's even lower. Harris Health in Houston did not even bill the federal government for 80% of the roughly 1,300 uninsured COVID-19 patients that it has treated through mid-July. And nationally, the total average for uninsured COVID patients is $73,000. Oh, boy. And that's just another argument about why we need a third party. The Democrats are aware of this problem. Part of it can be blamed on the Republican majority in the Senate, but not all. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, the total caseload now is 25.3 million. Total deaths are at 847,000. Here in the United States, it's over 6 million cases, with the total deaths reported at 183,000. And what we're seeing, again, is that early in the week, the numbers that are reported are fairly low. I believe the death toll reported as of Sunday is under 400 nationwide. But as we saw the last 2 or 3 weeks, by Wednesday or Thursday, that number creeps up over 1,000. So Linda today is focusing on the claims that we're going to have a vaccine, including the outlandish claim offered by Trump last week at his acceptance speech. Quote, "We are delivering life-saving therapies and will produce a vaccine before the end of the year, or maybe even sooner." Well, in an interview with the Financial Times, the FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn said his agency is prepared to authorize a vaccine before Phase 3 clinical trials are complete, as long as officials believe the benefits outweigh the risks. Now, this is a very dangerous cave-in on his part, and he's the guy who, a week ago Sunday, right before the Republican convention, allowed Trump to announce that the plasma, convalescent plasma, that's the correct medical term, had been shown in recent studies to reduce fatalities by 35%. And they haven't been able to produce those studies. But Hahn got played by Trump, and now he's setting himself up again. The quote continues from Hahn, "It's up to the sponsor, the vaccine developer, to apply for authorization or approval, and we make an adjudication of their application. If they do that before the end of Phase 3, we may find that appropriate. We may find that inappropriate. We will make a determination." But he's opened the door. And you can't expect Trump or his cronies in Big Pharma or the pharma executive who is running the so-called warp speed development of a vaccine program. They will see this not as a slightly open door, but a barn where the door has been entirely removed. Hahn insisted there's a safe way to make a vaccine available before the end of Phase 3, potentially by issuing an emergency authorization for use by certain groups rather than a blanket approval. Our emergency use authorization is not the same as a full approval. The legal, medical, and scientific standard for that is that the benefit outweighs the risk in a public health emergency. And Linda inserts this comment, which sounds like a Phase 3 trial, but with none of the usual precautions or rules. And David Dayen chimes in on this. He said the most chilling part of Trump's convention speech was this vaccine pledge. This is a dangerous promise because there's almost no way that can be done on such a fast track without FDA approval before the completion of all the trials. And Dayen continues, quoting Dr. Paul Offit of Children's Hospital Philadelphia. Several vaccines are in Phase 3 trials right now, but there's not much to be done to accelerate the process from there. You need 30,000 participants who must be recruited and split into receiving the vaccine and a placebo. They must be sufficiently diverse to account for the whole population. It's a 2-shot sequence. You have to wait 2 weeks between shots. Then the vaccine takes time to get through the system if it's to produce immunity. You have to wait for some people in the trial to get coronavirus with symptoms, or else you don't have any real data. For all that to happen by December would be remarkable, said Offit. Yes, it certainly would. And 78% of Americans worry that a COVID-19 vaccine approval process is being driven more by politics than science. This is a new survey from STAT and the Harris poll. The response is largely bipartisan, with 72% of Republicans, 82% of Democrats expressing worries. And this was conducted last week. It's a smaller than usual survey, only about 2,000 respondents. So it's got a higher prospect of inaccuracy. Anyway, the survey results, quote, just 46% of the public trust the president or the White House to provide accurate information about the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, with 71% of Republicans and only 28% of Democrats believing him. The poll also found that 67% of those surveyed said they would get a vaccine as soon as one is available. Americans appear more willing to do so over time, with 71% reporting they would get vaccinated 9 months after availability. And I want to note a couple of things on this issue. There is yellow journalism in today's Washington Post. In an article that I did not read in its entirety because it runs over 30 pages printed out, the headline reads, "Infected by Doubt." The subhead, "A 26-year-old film editor's descent into coronavirus vaccine conspiracy theories." Now, on Friday, I cited a pretty balanced article from the LA Times, which quoted a 53-year-old woman who had been vaccinated herself, had her children or child vaccinated. And she said, "I am vaccine hesitant. I am not reflexively anti-vax, but this is so politicized that, I am skeptical." And over the weekend, I talked to my friend Rona, a registered nurse of more than 40 years, and she volunteered to me, "Peter, I'm not going to be the first in line. And I have vaccinated all my children. She's got 4 of them. She's taken all the vaccines that have been recommended for her. And I think we are right to be skeptical. And the tone of this headline in the Washington Post is so offensive and so biased. And they report that this young film editor, who is unemployed right now, is now under the spell of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The article reports derisively that he started watching some videos online. There was Andrew Wakefield, the British ex-doctor behind a fraudulent study linking autism to the measles. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., whose transformation from crusading litigator to anti-vaccination firebrand had outraged other members of one of America's most storied political dynasties. And Judy Mikovits, a disgraced virologist who would soon become famous for her starring role in Plandemic. Now, as you know, I don't fully agree with Judy Mikovits or RFK Jr. on this. But I fully defend their right to speak and the right of people to listen to what they're saying. They should not be suppressed. They should not be vilified in this kind of a corporate media article. And the Washington Post ought to be ashamed of itself. That's my view. Meanwhile, The Guardian is reporting that politicians and commercial companies are competing to be the first to license a vaccine, but experts say the world would be better served by waiting until comprehensive results show at least 30 to 50% effectiveness. Ministers announced Friday that the United Kingdom would take emergency powers to push any vaccine through the regulatory processes with unprecedented speed. But deployment of a weekly effective vaccine could actually worsen the COVID-19 pandemic if authorities wrongly assume it causes a substantial reduction in risk, or if vaccinated individuals wrongly believe they are immune. And then there is the issue of people who are harmed by a vaccine that is rushed into service. And Americans who suffer adverse reactions will learn that they have to go to vaccine court. Pandemic-related claims for vaccines will be routed to a rarely used federal program set up to encourage drug makers to help combat public health emergencies. It spares pharmaceutical and device makers from liability lawsuits in exchange for taxpayers compensating injured patients, although it doesn't guarantee that there's funding to do so. Since the Vaccine Court program began in 2009, it has paid out less than $6 million, and it is yet to receive any dedicated U.S. government funding for COVID-19. And quoted here is Richard Topping, a former Justice Department attorney. In the best-case scenario, this is going to be a worst-case scenario. It will be a crisis. Rolling Stone cites a story published in the Washington Post that noted numerous incidents where agents contracted the virus. We're talking about Secret Service agencies on the Trump detail, or were exposed to someone who had. 5 agents helping plan security for the late July rally in Tampa had to be replaced when one of them tested positive, and others who were around the agent were presumed positive as well. Shortly thereafter, 2 more agents began to show symptoms after protecting the president as he played golf in Bedminster, New Jersey. And in Tulsa back in June, 6 advanced staff and 2 Secret Service agents contracted the virus before the president's arrival. And finally today, the Food and Drug Administration, late on Friday when nobody's paying attention, allowed the drug remdesivir to be used on all patients hospitalized with COVID-19, even though no published supports such widespread use. The approval allows doctors freedom to prescribe the antiviral earlier, but it comes less than a week after the agency approved use of convalescent plasma without published scientific support. And quoted is Dr. Eric Topol, Vice President for Research at the Scripps Institute in La Jolla, California. It seems to be a pattern of approval without science, without data, without evidence. The announcement was made at 5:20 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday. That's when you dump news that you don't want people to actually know about. Also, in his tweet storm over the weekend, Trump started quibbling with the data on the death toll from COVID-19. He reposted or retweeted messages claiming that while the official count is 183,000, that only around 9,000 people have actually died in the United States directly from coronavirus. So this was Trump retweeting an article from the Gateway Pundit that said, get this straight, based on the recommendation of Drs. Fauci and Birx, the U.S. shut down the entire economy based on 9,000 American deaths to the China virus. How did they get to this number? Well, it's a distortion of data at the Centers for Disease Control website, reporting that 6% of coronavirus fatalities list only the virus on the death certificates. Now, as I have long complained, the whole data collection for COVID-19 in the United States from beginning to end is a total hot mess. We don't have organized standards for what is a COVID death. People from ambulance drivers to an ER doctor who is overwhelmed fill out the death certificates, and we don't examine each death through a coroner or other forensics. So I consider the data to be highly unreliable, but not likely to be reduced by 94%. So this is an effort by Trump to once again corrupt the corrupted data, corrupt the perception that average voters have of the data, and try to set the stage for him to say, game over, we won, and you're not tired of winning yet, so re-elect me in November. Here in California, Governor Newsom on Friday issued a new set of standards for reopening businesses. And, for example, in San Francisco itself, beauty salons and barbershops are being given permission to give haircuts and other procedures, like hair coloring, outdoors. And that doesn't work for every business, but it will help some people get rid of their shaggy hairdos. So here's a quick summary of what the governor announced. So we have 4 levels. The purple level indicates widespread spread of the virus with more than 7 new COVID cases per 100,000 people each day, more than 8% positivity. Most non-essential business operations must remain closed under purple. Then there's red. Substantial spread, 4 to 7 near COVID cases per 100,000 people per day, 5 to 8% positivity, and, for example, this would allow a restaurant to reopen for indoor dining at 25% capacity. Schools may reopen for in-person instruction 2 weeks after the condition is moved from purple to red. Then we get to orange, the level orange, which indicates moderate spread, with 1 to 3.9 new COVID cases per 100,000 people per day, and a 2 to 5% positivity rate. That level will allow businesses to open with modifications, 50% indoor capacity. Then the yellow level, which is the mildest, it indicates minimal spread with less than 1 new COVID case per 100,000 people a day and less than 2% positivity. Most business operations can open with modifications. And here is the big change, that when a county gets shifted to a new tier, they have to stay in that tier for at least 3 weeks, 21 days. So it could take months for some of the hardest-hit California counties to move from purple to red, and then another 3 weeks before it can even apply to be downgraded from red to orange. The wildfires in California are getting more and more contained, but it is a slow process. And the air quality has improved slightly around the Bay Area. There are no new fires. We have no reports of new fatalities. Many more people have returned to their homes. Because one of the things about a fire is after it has passed through your area, if your house or other building is unscathed, the fire is highly unlikely to return to that area because there's no fuel left for it to burn. In Sacramento, this is the final day of the legislative session under the California procedures, and they still, at least as of the last time I checked around noon, the legislature had not come to terms and passed a new eviction shield law. And the language that is being discussed is that, and this would continue through March 1 of next year, that any missed rent going all the way back to March would be converted to civil debt, meaning it could not be used to evict a landlord. Landlords could pursue the money in small claims courts starting next March 1st. Tenants facing financial hardships because of the pandemic would be expected to pay 25% of their total rent between September and January, with the rest becoming civil debt. If they couldn't pay at least 25% of the rent for those 5 months by January 31st, landlords would be permitted to file to evict them starting in February. So they're trying to buy some time. It appears this takes a 2/3 majority because it is emergency legislation. And I reported to you the other day that all but one of the state Senate Republican caucus are sidelined with exposure to one state senator who tested positive after refusing to wear a mask or follow any of the other guidelines. Now we go to the courts. A federal district court judge has been authorized by an appeals panel to move forward with his review of the Attorney General's request to dismiss the charges against former Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. And the judge at the lower court, the trial level, Emmett Sullivan, had set up a process to evaluate the claim coming from the Attorney General that the charges should be dismissed, because it comes just as Judge Emmett Sullivan was ready to sentence Mike Flynn. So what's interesting is that the full Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia voted 8-2. The only two judges who voted against this ruling were the Trump appointees who originally authorized the writ of mandamus that allowed it to jump the process. And instead of waiting for the lower court to adjudicate, they basically instructed the lower court that it must dismiss. And I do believe that there's technical justification to dismiss these charges against Flynn. But I also want to preserve the court process, the credibility and the, like I say, the process where this lower court gets to complete its work before any appeals can take place. Also, at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, this is a surprise to me, they dismissed a House lawsuit seeking to force Trump's former White House counsel Don McGahn to comply with a congressional subpoena. The reason? They said Congress has not passed a law expressly authorizing it to sue to enforce its subpoenas. Really? I have to say, this is kind of breathtaking. Because from everything I know, and you know I'm not a lawyer, the precedent is clear that the House can issue subpoenas and the courts can enforce them. So the next step is the Supreme Court, and that is hardly a friendly venue for this particular case. A couple of quickies before I go. You know this Ring system where your doorbell has a camera in it? You can access that from your phone at home or anywhere else. It also is programmed to call your cell phone if somebody comes up and is ringing, dinging, dinging your doorbell. Well, get this. The unintended consequence here, according to a leaked FBI bulletin, law enforcement has discovered the downside of this privatized surveillance. The cameras are alerting residents when police show up with a warrant to arrest or to search the premises. So this leaked out through the hacked websites of fusion centers called Blue Leaks, and it was tagged as unclassified but law enforcement sensitive. So I'm wary of these things, and I would not install one at my house. But if you want to stay one step ahead of the law, it seems like a Ring doorbell camera might be a good addition to your toolbox. There's grumbling from the remaining professional employees who were at the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and the U.S. Agency for Global Media, Michael Pack, a hack and ally of Trump, was appointed there a couple of months ago. And today, 14 senior journalists at the Voice of America delivered a letter of complaint about Pack, saying his words and actions endanger the personal security of reporters at home and abroad, as well as threatening to harm U.S. national security objectives. One of the immediate triggers for the journalist's letter was an interview that Pack gave last week to a podcast run by a fiercely partisan pro-Trump website, The Federalist, in which Pack approved of Trump's description of VOA as disgusting, awash with political bias, and suggested that the broadcasters under his purview could be heavily infiltrated by foreign spies. The journalist said there has not been a single demonstrable case of any individual working for VOA turning out to be a spy. and they essentially challenged him to shut up or prove it. Online lenders are dangling money in front of hard-hit Americans. And in the fine print, if you don't read it carefully, you could wind up taking out a loan that comes from another state because these online loan brokers intentionally will assign you to the highest interest rate that can be elected for the money that you borrow. As of the end of 2019, an unprecedented 20.8 million Americans owed money on at least one personal loan. And they cite a case here in this article at The Intercept of a New Jersey man who was desperately trying to hold on to his business. And so his son said, well, why don't you go to one of these online lenders? Well, because they originate your loan from another state where the interest rates are higher and other rules may be relaxed, you can end up paying 25-30% or more per year. Some of these online lenders charge annual interest rates between 160 and 299%. So this is not a good bet. And there's so many Americans who are hard up for cash today that it could be a very dangerous trap. So in the case of this man, he applied for a loan from what he thought was Best Egg, but neither it nor its Delaware-based parent company, Marlette Funding, originated the loan. It came from a New Jersey financial institution called Cross River Bank. The annual interest rate is 27.25%. And the man who borrowed the money is based in Ohio, where the state laws there would limit the interest rate to 8% per year. Warren Buffett, the billionaire so-called Oracle of Omaha, I am interpreting what I'm about to tell you. But he has invested $6 billion in Japan's 5 biggest trading houses. And this article in The Guardian suggests this investment will help reduce Berkshire Hathaway's dependence on the U.S. economy, which in the last quarter contracted by the most in 73 years. And I'll take it even further. I think Warren Buffett may suspect, as I do, that the Federal Reserve can't prop up the stock market forever. And it is so far out of tune with the underlying economy, the distress of people who don't have work, who are facing eviction and don't have health insurance, that I think Mr. Buffett is hedging those bets by moving cash offshore. Maybe you should think about something similar. Finally today, this effort, which I've called piracy by the Trump administration, to force the sale of TikTok's American operations to an American company, well, it's hit new roadblocks erected by the dastardly Chinese communists in a bureaucratic two-step. On Friday, China updated its export control rules to cover a variety of technologies it deemed sensitive, including technology that sounds like TikTok's personalized recommendation engine. Then on Saturday, the official Xinhua news agency published commentary by a professor who said the new rule would mean that the video app's parent, ByteDance, might need a license to sell its technology to an American buyer. So that's going to shape up as a confrontation, as Trump's order that TikTok sell to an American company will either expire or he will attempt to make it effective. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it absolutely everywhere. You'll find it on YouTube, and I am Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.